the disciples to find the room to eat their final meal with Jesus? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Mark on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Mark chapter 14. We're going to be reading from verses 10 to 21. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Mark chapter 14, beginning at verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. There make ready for us." So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them. And they prepared the Passover. In the evening he came with the 12. Now as they sat and ate, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." And they began to be sorrowful and say to him one by one, "Is it I?" And another said, "Is it I?" He answered and said to them, "It is one of the 12 who dips with me in the dish. The Son of Man indeed goes just as is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had never been born." After taking a slight detour to tell us about Jesus being anointed with oil, Mark now returns us to the timeline of the beginning of the chapter. In verses 1 and 2, we find the chief priests, scribes, and elders gathering together to find a way that they could kill Jesus while avoiding the crowds. Now, coming to verse 10, we find Judas leaving Jesus and the disciples at some point in time and going to the chief priests with a message. He will deliver Jesus to them, but for a price. Many wonder why Judas, one of the 12 closest men to Jesus, would offer to betray Jesus. We aren't told here, but the book of John makes it clear that Judas loved money, and so he thought this was an opportunity to make some money, while most likely thinking that Jesus would get away, meaning that he would be richer with nobody knowing. Mark doesn't tell us how much money Judas received, but from our study of Matthew, we know it was 30 pieces of silver. Coming out of verse 12, we have the final hours of Jesus' life. Mark is a little more clear than Matthew was in identifying this day, for he calls it the first day of unleavened bread, while Matthew called it the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. The actual day that we're talking about here has been subject to much controversy, for some say we're talking about Tuesday, some Wednesday, while others say we're talking about Thursday. The problem doesn't come from the gospel accounts themselves, and wouldn't have been confusing to those who originally read it. The problem comes with our misunderstanding of how Jews calculated days and how they referred to this feast. Remember, the Jews calculated their days from sundown to sundown. And since the Feast of Unleavened Bread occurred around the same time as the Passover, the entire 8-day festival became known as the Passover. So what day is this? Well, if you recall at the beginning of the chapter, Mark told us that after 2 days it was the Passover. The time reference was to the end of chapter 13, which would have been the beginning of the 4th day of the week, as the Jews reckoned days. That meant that the Passover was to be eaten on the 6th day of the week at twilight, what we would call late afternoon on Friday. That would make this day the 5th day of the week, what we would call Thursday. If the Passover was to be eaten the next night, though, on the 6th day, and this was the 5th day, why then was it referred to as the first day of unleavened bread? It is because it would be on this day that the Jews were required to clear their houses of leaven during this feast, and thus they would spend the day before doing this. So what Mark is actually referring to is the day that they did this, which again would be on what we call Thursday, the 5th day of the week. It is on this day that the disciples come to Jesus and ask where they want them to prepare to eat the Passover. They were asking where to prepare for the 8-day feast, since the Passover referred to the entire feast. Jesus tells them to go into the city, and they would find a man who was carrying a pitcher of water. They were to follow him. Wherever he went in, they were to say to the master of the house, "The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" The master would then show them a large upper room furnished and gathered. It was there that they would make ready for the meal. The disciples went and did just as Jesus told them to. When evening came, they all sat down to eat. It is now the beginning of the 6th day of the week, according to a Jewish reckoning of time, but still Thursday evening, the way we reckon time. This meal was not the Passover meal, but a common meal, as the Passover meal would be eaten at twilight on the next night. During the meal, Jesus revealed to the disciples that one of them would betray him. Each disciple wondered if it was him, to which Jesus said it was him who dipped his hand with him in the dish. Jesus does add something here that Matthew omits, which was that for the man who betrayed Jesus, it would have been good for that man to have never been born. Why is that? Because Jesus knew what Judas would do, in that Jesus knew his heart. Judas was not going to survive the evening, but kill himself after seeing what would happen to Jesus. Judas would thus die in his sins and would face God in that condition on the judgment day. Certainly it would have been better for him not to have been born than to be cast away from God for all of eternity. With that, our time is up for today, Lord willing. We hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Mark chapter 14, verses 22 to 31, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.